Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. We have wrestled Zach Osterman away from completing another immaculate grid. He is here with us on Podcast on the Brink. Zach, welcome back to the show.
It's Kerry Lightenberg Day.
What's that?
Braves legend Kerry Lightenberg in the immaculate grid today. 0.06. He was traded to the Braves. He was traded to the Braves for a bunch of used baseball equipment. He played for an independent league team in Minnesota that was owned by a former Braves catcher named Greg Olson. And Olson called the Braves and he was like, I think I've got a guy. And I need bats and balls. Do you want to trade? And they were like, yes. And he had one really good half season. So there you go.
Our Atlanta Braves trivia for the day on Podcast on the Brink. We're, of course, here to talk about Indiana basketball. And before we dive into this matchup against Kansas, which will be happening Saturday afternoon in Bloomington, Zach, I wanted to get kind of your big picture thoughts of where Indiana is right now this season. I think if you were an outsider just kind of dropping in, hadn't watched much of this team so far this year, and you saw Indiana 7-2 record, they've beaten Maryland, they've beaten Michigan. Well, they're off to a pretty good start. But you look at the computer numbers and some of the other trends of the season. For those of us maybe follow it more closely, there's some things that are obviously concerning. I'm curious from your perspective, just what you make of this 7-2 start for the Hoosiers, where they stand, and maybe kind of what path they're on as we, a quarter of the season in.
I think it's always difficult because, especially in the era of the portal, it's really hard to forecast what to expect when you see the schedule come out in August or September. For example, on paper, you would have thought Maryland and Michigan would actually be a quietly tough start to Big Ten play, whereas times in the past we've seen Indiana with the maybe lesser iterations of Chris Collins Northwestern or Pat Chambers Penn State. They've opened against Nebraska a couple of times. You would have looked at that and said, well, those are two programs that have been in and around the NCAA tournament conversation the last few years. They've been tough for Indiana to beat. Indiana hadn't won at Michigan for 7 years or 6 years before last year. And to go 2-0 on those two games, if you'd said preseason, that's what Indiana's going to do, then you would say, well, that's good. That's a really good start. And, to be fair, Maryland's kind of a mess. I do think they've kind of pulled together just a little bit. They had to kind of squeeze by Penn State, but they battered Alcorn State on Tuesday. That Michigan game may still. I think it's still a quad win right now. It may stand up as one all season. And you should never really complain about winning Big Ten. That's the other part of it, especially a young team, a new team going on the road, first time of asking and winning. I think is important. And if I'd said, well, Indiana's going to be 7-2 and their two losses will be UConn and Auburn, you'd say, well, yeah, that's kind of what I would expect from this team. That, we all said this group was going to go through some real growing pains. To me, the outlier is the Auburn game, because that Connecticut game, to be fair, they were competitive in for long stretches without ever really feeling like they were in control of it. And then it just kind of got away from them at the end. The Auburn game obviously was just a capitulation, 104 points. They lost by 28. That was actually a 40-point swing from the 12-point lead they had about 7 minutes into the game. We can talk about the game if you want. I have a theory that I doubt anyone will ever confirm to me. I think they were all sick. That doesn't excuse 28 points, but, there'd been suggestions that something had been going around the team all week. And if you watch them in that game, they just look like they just don't have a gear to compete with Auburn. And I think Auburn knows it, and Auburn kind of pounces on it to their credit. But it's kind of, I guess the way I've described this is, the highs have not been super high. The lows have been pretty low, at least in the big picture, a 20-point loss to UConn, a 28-point loss to Auburn. But in the broadest way possible, I just sort of thought this was what Indiana would be, in November and December and maybe even part of January. And while I'm not trying to sort of paint an overly rosy picture, Indiana's metrics do not look great right now. They're 78 in KenPom. I think they're still in the 120s in the net. What I would say is, at very least, they've sort of proven themselves capable of competing in what might be a below average Big Ten. And that, I think, gives them a bit more of a shot once once conference play restarts to kind of get their feet under them. And I don't think they're going to win the Big Ten, but, kind of tackle the schedule in a more meaningful way. These two games, Auburn, which has already been played, and Kansas, which I know we're going to talk about, are kind of the ones that, to me, are going to wind up coloring a lot of what we think about these first 2 months of the season.
So just how important in your mind is Saturday's game against Kansas? When you look at what Indiana's done in the non-conference, obviously they have some wins. They've, I think, 5 non-conference wins. Haven't really beaten a team overall right now in my mind. It's going to make the tournament. Obviously, it's very early to even be worrying about a resume, but those are things as we kind of get into January and February, you'll start to think about when you look at what a team has accomplished. To me, the Kansas game can really kind of change the narrative of the direction of the season if they were able to go out and get that game, because obviously it's a win that's going to stand out on a resume right now. Quite frankly, the Big Ten, you look at what it's done in the non-conference, hasn't really done a heck of a lot to inspire confidence that this is going to be a league that's one of the top couple in the country right now. And I think it's definitely a win that would have staying power on the resume. But more importantly, I think with the showings that they've had against Connecticut and Auburn, to be more competitive or to even win a game like this, I think can help from a confidence standpoint as this team moves forward. Just how much importance are you putting on? I know it's December 16th when this game is going to be played. There's a ton of basketball to be playing, but just how big in your mind is this game for Indiana?
No, I mean, I think it's important for basically every reason you can imagine. I think it would mean a lot to just beat Indiana and beat Kansas, frankly. I'm not accusing Kansas of anything, but, I wouldn't blame Kansas if they're not quite as ramped up for this game as Indiana is. Because, if you look at Indiana, if you're Kansas, you're saying, boy, we got bigger games right now. So it probably means more to Indiana. It's also at home, which, I think the only really truly bad outcome of this game is Indiana getting run off its own floor. I think, if you talk about the intangible stuff, the confidence this team would take from winning a game like this, if you'd said, again, with all of the turnover in the offseason, and, if you could have kind of removed maybe the most sort of doe-eyed, expectations of this team early on and just looked at things in a very sort of practical way, if you'd said Indiana will win one of the UConn, Auburn, and Kansas games, I think we would have said, great. Like that would probably give Lynn the impression this team would be ahead of schedule, frankly. And I think it would do this team's confidence a world of good if it were able to win a game like this. I think the more tangible stuff, and you're right, I have a hard and fast rule that I don't cite bracket projections except in special cases before Valentine's Day, because I just don't like it. You can get wrapped up in that stuff so fast, and then 2 weeks later it's all changed because somebody goes on a winning streak or somebody goes on a losing streak, and it just, it becomes this thing. I get why we do it. It's a talking point. It's fun. It's interesting. It's largely harmless. But then you kind of get to a point in the season where it's like you're fretting about games in late December or early January when that's not the time to be doing it. Having said that, obviously it would become, even at home, a sort of crown jewel in your certainly your non-conference, but really your NCAA tournament resume. Again, I think it would be a boost for a team that has measured up against a couple of other high-level teams this season and found itself wanting. As long as you took care of those 3 games around Christmas, Morehead State, North Alabama, Kennesaw State, you would come out of the non-conference in pretty good shape. Like if you'd said, again, if we just said Indiana will not lose to any of the bad teams it's going to play, start 2-0 in the Big Ten, and be 11-2, I guess that would be on January 1st, you'd say that's a fantastic position. That's for a team that turned over half its roster, lost all those seniors, all that production, has going to have to find out all this other stuff about itself. And then, by the way, Xavier Johnson's going to get injured, and he's not going to, we'll see if he plays against Kansas. Mike Woodson didn't really paint an optimistic picture, but he's not going to play against Maryland, against Michigan, against Auburn, against Kansas, and they're still going to get out of all of that 11-2 and 2-0. You'd say that's fantastic. But in the same breath, you'd also say this is a team that now has crossed some important things off. It's won a conference game on the road. You and I have both covered games or seasons where we're still asking in February, Are you guys worried about not having any, meaningful road wins? Or, I mean, I remember when Indiana went, I think it was the season that got cut short by COVID, not the one after, where Indiana beat a Minnesota team that almost certainly wasn't going to make the NCAA tournament, but it was a huge deal because Indiana just needed a road win on its schedule to go with what it had done at home. So you already crossed that off. You've given yourself a good platform. There is if you're the sort of team that could beat Kansas, there's a plausible path to being like 5-1 heading into the Purdue game. I'm not saying they will be, but I'm saying the path is there. And then suddenly you feel like you're kind of on a march, you're moving in a certain direction. I don't think they're going to win the league, but it's kind of one of those where you're doing work early so you don't have to do it late. And then if you beat Kansas, you wouldn't feel the pressure of getting some of the stuff done that you need to do in the conference if you can kind of keep rolling there. And you would not feel, as you got deeper into conference plays, you go to Wisconsin away or Illinois away or either of the Purdue games, Ohio State away, you would not feel the urgency of, we got to pick up a real signature win here that's kind of an anchor point. Like if you beat Kansas, in a way, suddenly that Michigan win looks better because it's not your best win. It's not the win that's holding up your non-conference work. Suddenly it's, they beat Kansas, and also they won that game at Michigan. That was a nice win. And hey, like Harvard might win the Ivy this year, and they beat them on a neutral floor, or at least semi-neutral floor. You're allowed to color a lot of that stuff differently. And it just gives you a boost in so many ways that, again, to be honest, Kansas may not feel like it needs. They've got 3 top 25 Ken Pom wins already this season. They're, their Ken Pom's projection for them right now is to go 11-7 in Big 10 and Big 12 play, and that's including some games where they are, the underdog by like 2 points. So those are basically just toss-ups away from home for the most part. It is the sort of game that you never know what's going to happen, but it could become a pivot point in Indiana's season. It feels like, given what's come before it and what will come after it, a game where we're gonna push a thumbtack in the wall one way or another and say this was an important date on the season.
So one of the things that we've both learned after talking to Mike Woodson now for 2.5 seasons of pregame media availabilities, he doesn't like to dive into a lot of specifics in terms of game plans. I don't think that's too uncommon with any coach preparing for a game like this. But we talked to him just about an hour and a half ago over Zoom, and there was some question just about the response to the Auburn game, what they've worked on this week. Not a lot of specifics given by Mike Woodson, as I mentioned, not terribly uncommon. But I'm curious from your perspective as they prepare for Kansas, who I've already written my preview and it's been published out for a day, but the things that stood out to me was just how experienced they are at several key positions. They're obviously not a deep team, but when you lead the country in assist rate, which is basically the percentage of their field goals that are assisted, tells me that they're committed to running their stuff. They execute well, not a lot of one-on-one play. They score a ton of points off of cuts. Their 2-point field goal percentage defense is very good. So these are all things that just kind of stood out for me looking at Kansas. But from an Indiana perspective, what do they have to do particularly well on Saturday to be able to come out and pull off the upset? We know Assembly Hall is going to be juiced up. You and I have been to plenty of games like this in Bloomington where the crowd is, there's a feeling in the building right when you step in that something special could happen that day. I'm not saying it always leads to a victory. I mean, I can remember, I think it was Tom Crean's maybe second season. I don't recall exactly which one. They played a Kentucky team with John Wall and Eric Bledsoe and DeMarcus Cousins. Indiana had no business being in that game. They were right in that game at halftime. So anything can obviously happen when Assembly Hall is lathered up.
Wasn't that the Maurice Creek game?
It was.
Yeah, when
they were right,
had like 31 points or something. Yeah,
they were right in that game at halftime. So we know that the crowd's going to have Indiana engaged early. Being able to sustain that for a full 40 minutes is totally different. But I'm just curious from your perspective, what does Indiana have to do in this game to give themselves a chance to win?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I don't think every element of what gave Indiana trouble last season is there this year. I think Kansas has, at least on paper, fewer shooters. I don't think Kansas is going to be able to use its length in the same way that it did last year. I think Indiana was almost surprised in some respects by Kansas's length last season defensively. But you don't have, last season, Kansas at any given time could have as many as 3 players on the floor that you had to follow all the way out to 25 feet because Jalen Wilson didn't do it as much, but he could hit that shot. Grady Dick obviously could. And if you let Kevin McCullough get going, he can be that kind of 3-point shooter. He's maybe a little bit more streaky than Dick was last year, but kind of the first thing you have to do is you talk about winning some of those one-on, or you talk about just the good individual players they have. You've got to win some of those one-on-one matchups. I suspect we're going to see a lot of KJ Adams on Malik Renew. Renew's got to be better than anybody was against KJ Adams at Fog Island last year. Obviously, the Hunter Dickinson, Khalil Ware thing is probably going to be a running storyline. Can one get the other in foul trouble? Can Ware keep Dickinson from hurting Indiana behind the 3-point line? Can Dickinson match up with Ware when Ware's probably got a few more sort of athletic and physical advantages? I think one of the things you can't do, because you talk about how efficient they can be, how well they share the ball. I think you mentioned this, but they're 22nd in the country in 2-point field goal percentage. They finish really, really well. They are not a particularly prolific 3-point shooting team. It's not as pronounced of a, sort of like a weakness or it's not so lopsided as Indiana's, kind of 2-point, 3-point, but it's not that far off. They only score 26% of their points off threes. They only, they at 30.4% of their field goal attempts are 3-pointers. That's 320th in the country. They don't shoot a ton. Now they have guys who can make them. Dickinson is 10 of 17. McCullough's shooting over 40%. Johnny Furphy, who, God bless him. I always see his name and think his name is Johnny Murphy. He's shooting 44%. DeJuan Harris has only shot 18 of them, but he's shooting 44.4%, same percentage. The first thing you can't do is let a team that's already going to be able to hurt you in some other ways hurt you in a way they don't normally hurt teams. You can't let McCullough get loose, or Nicholas Timberlake, who's really struggled through kind of this early portion of the season after transferring in from Towson. You can't let him get on there and be like, oh, I remember how this feels. And suddenly they've made 8 or 9 threes in the first half, and it's been such a grind just to keep up. I think the other part of this, and this is probably just going to be true for a while for Indiana, at least until Xavier Johnson is back, is you have got to be able to manage point guard as best you can, whether it's Gabe Cupp, CJ Gunn. DeJuan Harris is one of the, he's not a huge scorer, but he's one of the best creators in the country, and he's been doing it for a long time. You've got to manage him as well as you possibly can. And then the other part of it is, until Indiana's offensive profile changes, they have to win in the paint. Like, they just, that is, and you maybe somebody hits 7 threes tomorrow, but you can't account for that. You can't assume that. There's nobody on your roster that you can look at right now and say, well, if we get him going from 3, it's going to be a real problem. So if Mackenzie Mbako goes out there and he hits 4 of his first 5, great. That's fantastic. But that can't be part of your plan. Your plan has to start with, they've got KJ Adams and Hunter Dickinson. We've got Malik Renew and Khalil Ware. Malik Renew and Khalil Ware have to outplay KJ Adams and Hunter Dickinson, because that is so much where Indiana's bread is buttered right now, that until they can prove that they can do it other ways offensively, they cannot leave those 2 strengths. Those guys have to play well. They have to stay out of foul trouble. And Indiana's got to make sure that they don't lose them in the flow of the offense as well.
The guard situation for Indiana continues to be a big question mark, just in terms of the depth and the production that they're getting from, obviously, just the backcourt in general. How important is Trey Galloway kind of in a game like this? Because there's a ton of uncertainty about Xavier Johnson's health. To me, obviously, I don't want to put words in Mike Woodson's mouth, but it didn't sound like anything was imminent in terms of Xavier Johnson coming back. Of course, he could surprise us all and play tomorrow, but Mike Woodson was pretty careful with his words and didn't really, he didn't necessarily sound optimistic. Not that he would come out and say that we're getting closer, but by saying I don't know yet, doesn't really inspire a ton of confidence. We know from an offensive perspective, Gabe Cupps is very limited right now, doesn't look for a lot of offense. done a really steady job, I think, in my mind, of being able to hold his own as a freshman. But he's obviously his best basketball is ahead. But for Trey Galloway in his fourth season, 3-point shooting numbers completely have fallen off the map this year. Doesn't look nearly as confident as he has in previous years. Maybe a little bit miscast in terms of his role, just being asked to do a little bit more than maybe he's even capable of. But the reality is, this is the situation that they're in, and he has to be better. I'm just curious in a matchup like this, especially with McCullough and how good he's averaging 19 points a game. It's not just Hunter Dickinson. This is a guy that's a fifth year senior. He can be a really tough matchup. And I assume that Trey Galloway is going to spend a lot of time against him. I'm just kind of curious how important you think it is. And maybe this is an obvious question, that Indiana gets a lot more in this game and moving forward from Trey Galloway than what they've gotten recently.
Yeah, broadly speaking, yes, I think Indiana needs more from Galloway, particularly offensively. I do think in this game, I don't want to say any offense is a bonus, but I think, Trey Galloway is going to come off the floor Saturday afternoon, and he's going to feel good or bad about his performance, I think, first and foremost, based on how he plays defensively. And I'm just generally more curious about the matchups overall. Mackenzie Mbako is obviously big and long, and sort of in terms of measurables, he matches up with McCullough. But we've seen him struggle in some one-on-one covers this season, which that happens with freshmen. That's I think particularly that part of kind of the sort of brow furrowing around Mbako's first few games here as a freshman has been a little bit misplaced. This is what freshmen go through. The flip side is, if you look at Kansas's most frequently used lineups over the last 5 games on KenPom, DeJuan Harris is in every single one of them. And I could see a temptation to try and put Galloway on Harris and try and just disrupt that offense. But then what would you do with Gabe Cupps? Obviously, the bench has still got to come along for Indiana in some key ways. But I do think one of the things that's developed is some impact guard depth defensively, maybe not offensively. But I think CJ Gunn has given you good minutes. I think Caleb Banks, when he's been able to stay out of foul trouble, has given you good minutes. So I guess my question is basically just, how does Indiana handle these matchups? And I think Galloway on McCullough probably makes the most sense early on, but then you've got to figure out what you're doing with DeJuan Harris, while your starters are in, and then possibly even as you pivot to the bench. And then they'll move. The other interesting thing about looking at these lineups, and obviously this isn't inexact science. There's nobody at KenPom that's watching 40 minutes of every game and charting exactly where guys are on the floor at any given time. But the other thing that is interesting about these frequently used lineups is Kevin McCullough's in every one of them too. In 7 of them, he's listed as the 3. In 2 of them, he's listed as the 2. And in 1 of them, he's listed as the 4. So that's one of the less used lineups. It's the 7th most used lineup in the last 5 games. But it's one where Kansas goes Harris, Elmarko Jackson, Nicholas Timberlake, and then McCullough at the 4, and basically goes really small. Now some of this may also just be a product of who Kansas has played. Sometimes you get those guarantee games and you have to play a little bit smaller. But you just look at kind of where Bill Self has distributed minutes at what positions. And I'm just kind of curious, where Mike Woodson, almost decides to say it's more important to take this player away than it is that player. Because I agree with you. I don't think they're going to have Xavier Johnson, at least based on Mike Woodson's sort of comments. And maybe he's trying to pull a fast one. Maybe Johnson will play. But, it sometimes you just have to pick a spot to start. And that sounds simplistic, but you just have to, when you're facing a team that can hurt you with a lot of different pieces, you just have to kind of pick one spot and say, we're going to start there. Where, we think based on our scouting and our evaluation, this is the sort of best place to go to kind of cut off what they do well at the root. And then if that doesn't work, you adjust. But I am curious, because you've got a player like Mackenzie Mbako that's got some obvious physical advantages, but maybe is still figuring out some of the defensive kind of instincts. And you got a player like Gabe Cupps who's going to work hard for you defensively, but is probably going to struggle against a junior point guard, for example, with all the experience DeJuan Harris has. I'm just curious, kind of, not just where Indiana starts matchup wise, but how it adjusts when it goes to the bench, how it adjusts when maybe somebody gets loose and you feel like you got to change your coverages.
Yeah, it's maybe I was assuming that Galloway is on McCullough, and that's not going to be the case. But I just kind of look at this from a perspective of which guys, El Marco Jackson is this 5-star freshman, came in with a lot of obviously expectations, but not one of their bigger options, at least at this point offensively. And so it is interesting to me just how Mike Woodson's going to choose to attack these matchups early in the game. And maybe obviously there's going to be adjustments as the game goes on. I just don't know that Mbako on McCullough is going to yield positive results. But then you kind of look at, all right, well, if Trey Galloway is going to be on McCullough, Mackenzie Mbako is going to guard El Marco Jackson. That's going to have to be the other obvious matchup. So there's, to me, a potential matchup problem there. Maybe we see a situation where if Indiana decides that Mbako is not going to be able to be the solution defensively in this game, where you see CJ Gunn and Gabe Cupps and Trey Galloway out there together, if that's kind of what they have to do as the game goes along. It's just interesting to me because we know McCullough and Harris are going to be out there for 32, 34 minutes a game. I mean, that's what they're playing. Kansas doesn't have a ton of depth. The other thing they don't do a lot is they don't foul their opponents. They've done a remarkable job of staying out of foul trouble. And I think that is another kind of interesting thing as I look at these matchups. Indiana's 8th, I believe, in the country in free throw rate, which is the percentage of free throws attempted divided by field goals attempted, essentially a measure of how well you get to the line as a team. Kansas doesn't send his opponents to the line very often. Something's going to have to give in that regard because Indiana is obviously going to be going in the paint. How efficiently can they score in the paint and at the rim, and how often can they get to the free throw line? I think is going to tell us a lot about just how successful they are as a team offensively tomorrow, particularly when you look at some of the 2-point field goal percentages that Kansas, some of their opponents have shot against them in several of their games. I mean, they've held some really good teams down to some low numbers, 2-point field goal percentage wise. So I just think some fascinating matchups. Obviously, we know Bill Self is one of the best to do it right now in the game of college basketball. So I think he's going to have his team well prepared. So there's going to be some moves that are made from a matchup perspective as the game goes along. One other thing I just wanted to ask you about, and this keeps coming up. I know you wrote about it. It was talked about this morning in the media availability. I have people asking me about it every day. Does Indiana need to shoot more 3-pointers? We've talked about it, I think. And I think I've kind of come to the conclusion that obviously it's just not in the cards right now for this Indiana roster as constructed for them to take a much higher volume of 3-point shooting, whether that be out of a belief from Mike Woodson that the ball has to go inside because that is our strength and that is our best chance to win games, or the fact that this team just doesn't maybe have the shooters on the perimeter that you want taking a higher volume of 3. But big picture, how important is it for Indiana to address this moving forward? Do you think this is something that's being overblown? Do you think this is something that needs to, obviously, I'm not talking about this specific season because I don't necessarily think that 9 games in and with what we've seen on this roster, it's going to change. I'm just curious how big of an issue you see this as from a long-term perspective for this program as it tries to maybe go up another level under Mike Woodson.
So I'm doing some quick math while we talk because I think there's one thing that's kind of relevant to this. The first thing I would say is, there's been a lot of criticism of Mike Woodson for not adding more shooting. Indiana did try with a couple guys, didn't work out. One of them was, Nicholas Timberlake, who's gone to Kansas and not really shot the ball very well. Mackenzie Mbako has not shot anywhere near what his reputation. Even if you sort of took the scouting evaluations, Mbako was a bit of a streaky shooter and he could kind of burn hot and cold at times. You still, I think, would have been fair in expecting him to shoot better than 20.7%. I think you certainly would have been fair in expecting Trey Galloway to shoot more than 13.6%. I mean, that's even below the numbers he was putting up in his first couple years before he kind of found his shooting stroke last year. And of course, last season was really good on a low volume of attempts, but was really good shooting the 3, even if he were not taking a ton of shots from 3, and he's not. He's only attempted 22 in 9 games. That's, that's less than 2.5 threes a game. if he were anywhere near last year's numbers, he would have made 5 or 6 more threes. And then I think people forget this in a weird way about Xavier Johnson. Since he got to Indiana, he's a 38.9% three-point shooter. And that's removing, a guy that can shoot both spot up threes and also maybe the only legitimate, at least as things are constructed right now, the only sort of true sort of consistent pull-up three-point threat as well for Indiana. So there's a little bit of maybe Indiana could have done more to add shooting. And I certainly agree that Indiana needs to shoot the ball better going forward, like just in the long term. I think they need more volume. I don't think they need to be shooting, the 10th most threes per game in the country. They just need to be closer to the average, like the national average. They need to be hitting more. Yes, again, Mike Woodson could have added more shooting. He tried. Could he have tried harder? Sure, probably. On the other hand, I would also point out that Indiana is kind of in the position where it had 3 or 4 guys that I think it would have been fair to expect could make more of an impact from behind the three-point line that for one reason or other just aren't right now. And so there's kind of that element of it too. And so I think long-term, Indiana's got to do more to backstop this problem. It's been going on for 6.5 years now. It certainly doesn't show any signs of improving within the confines of this season. You never know, but I don't think it will. But in the same breath, for this team right now, this season, you said you don't think it's on the cards. What I would say is, I don't know that Mike Woodson looks at this team and says the solution is to shoot more threes when they can't even consistently make the ones that they're shooting. They're barely shooting over 27% from three. Those numbers aren't quite as nationally bad as, three-point attempts as a percentage of overall field goal attempts, or, they are second to last in the country in the percentage of points they score off three-pointers. That's remarkable. But at the same time, there's an extent to which you have to balance as a coach, what you are with what you want to be, and where you are with where you want to go. And if you start sacrificing wins at the altar of just firing up a ton of threes, hoping that you can kind of shoot guys into form, that can be dangerous too. And especially when you've got, at least to my eye, 2 legitimate all-league post players who play really well together. That's the other thing that I think we've talked a lot individually in our various, what we've written, what we've, I'm sure you've talked about it or written about it. I have, all across sort of the media sphere, how good Malik Renew and Clell Ware have been individually. I think we underappreciate how well they play together. One's a right-hander and one's a left-hander, so they're not necessarily going to get in each other's way naturally. They want to score in different ways. Ware can score facing up. He obviously can step out behind the three-point line. At times it feels like he just kind of scores by virtue of the fact that he can just get the ball up higher than anybody else. And that's going to be an interesting sort of matchup with Hunter Dickinson on Saturday. Whereas Renew has just kind of this library of post moves that he wants to get the ball. He wants to attack kind of from the block in. He goes to the baseline a lot. I think he's gotten a lot better with his right hand. And while he still gets in foul trouble sometimes, he's only committing 3.8 per 40 this year. He was committing 6.8 per 40 last year. In conference play alone, he was averaging almost 8 fouls per 40 minutes. This year it's 4.6, which is still high, but it shows improvement from where he was as a freshman. And I think there's an extent to to which Mike Woodson might be fair in saying, I hear everybody who says we should shoot more threes. I understand that threes are more part of the offensive game than what we're doing. But this, the best solution may not be to just go out there and order guys to start chucking up threes without any real confidence that they'll make them, when we've got not just 1, but 2 really good post players that don't really get in each other's way very much. Because they're different kinds of scorers offensively, there's room for both of them down there. And if we start neglecting those players just to fire up more one-pass threes, that, sure, it could shoot some guys into a little bit better form, but it could also just totally deep six your offense and isolate your best players when you need them most.
Zach, it's always good to talk to you on the podcast. Everyone, make sure to follow Zach on Twitter, X, whatever they're calling it these days, at Zach Osterman. Follow his work and subscribe at the Indianapolis Star. Zach, always good to talk to you.
Absolutely. Always good to be here. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoy the show, Please, as always, leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, preferably a 5-star if that's what you feel about the show. We would appreciate it. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.